Jamal West's life changed in an instant, not with a bang, but with an unjust arrest that would send shockwaves through the city's law enforcement. It was supposed to be just another morning, a quick walk to his car, a message from his mother about dinner plans, a peaceful day ahead. But as Jamal walked through the bustling streets, unaware of the tension brewing in the air, two police officers, Riley and Jenkins, approached him with suspicion. Jamal, calm and composed, had dealt with situations like this before. He had learned to navigate the bias, the unfair treatment, the subtle racism that always seemed to be just beneath the surface. But today was different. He had done nothing wrong. He was just another black man in a nice neighborhood, dressed well, trying to go about his business. But to Riley and Jenkins, that was enough to cast him as a suspect. They demanded his identification, and Jamal kept his cool, not wanting to escalate the situation. However, as Riley grabbed his arm with unnecessary force and twisted it behind his back, Jamal knew this was no misunderstanding. It was another example of systemic injustice. What Jamal didn't know was that this seemingly ordinary interaction would unfold into something far more profound. This was not just about a black man being wrongfully arrested. It was about exposing deep-rooted corruption and racial prejudice, a story that would reverberate far beyond the streets of the city. When Jamal's true identity is revealed, the entire police station would be left speechless, and a monumental reckoning would unfold, one that would change everything. It was a typical morning in the heart of the city. The sun began to rise, casting long shadows on the crowded streets as the city came alive. People hurried along the sidewalks, going about their daily routines, grabbing coffee, heading to work, or walking their dogs. The air was thick with the sounds of car horns, distant sirens, and the chatter of busy people. Amidst this energetic scene, Jamal West walked with a sense of calm. At 34 years old, he had grown used to the rhythm of the city, the ebb and flow of its daily hustle. He stood out, not because of his attire, but because he always seemed unbothered, centered, as if no matter the chaos around him, he could find his peace. His sharp suit, tailored perfectly to his frame, gave the impression of a man who knew exactly who he was and where he was going. As he strolled down the street, the buzz of his phone in his pocket caught his attention. He pulled it out, seeing a message from his mother reminding him about their dinner plans later that evening. Smiling, he quickly typed out a reply, telling her he hadn't forgotten and was looking forward to it. Family meant everything to him, and he made it a priority to stay connected despite his busy schedule. He could feel the warmth of their bond even through a simple text. Just as he was about to unlock his sleek black sedan, the hum of the city began to fade as two police officers, Riley and Jenkins, approached him. Jamal had seen this before. He had felt the heavy suspicion in the air, the way people looked at him as though he didn't belong in certain places. But this was different. There was a tension that filled the space between them, a sense of unease that immediately set off Jamal's instincts. He hadn't done anything wrong, and yet here they were, blocking his path. He glanced at them, then back to his car. His mind raced as he weighed his options, how to respond, what to say. In a moment like this, words could either defuse or escalate the situation. He chose to remain calm, maintaining a neutral expression as he asked, "May I ask why?" The officers didn't immediately answer. Instead, Riley's eyes narrowed, and the corners of his mouth twitched in what seemed like amusement. "Just show us your ID, sir. It's a simple request," he said, his tone not as polite as it seemed. Jamal could feel the shift in the air, the change in their approach. It was a routine he had seen countless times before, but the anger and frustration of being judged solely by the color of his skin surged inside him. It was a familiar, suffocating feeling. Jamal's stomach tightened. He had seen this kind of thing play out before, but each time it felt like a punch to the gut. A black man, well-dressed, in a nice neighborhood. He must be doing something wrong. His entire body tensed as he fought to remain calm, but he knew where this was going. The officers were testing him, pushing him to react in a way that justified their preconceived notions. "Look," Jamal said carefully, maintaining a steady voice. "I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding. I'm just trying to get to my car, head to work. I haven't done anything wrong." He hoped his words would cut through the tension, but Riley didn't seem to hear him. Instead, Riley took a step closer, his posture growing more aggressive. Jamal took a small, measured step back, trying to maintain distance, but Riley wasn't letting up. "What kind of work do you do?" Riley asked, narrowing his eyes, clearly sizing him up. "I'm a lawyer," Jamal replied, trying to keep his voice steady, his heart hammering in his chest. The moment the words left his mouth, he saw a flicker of recognition in the officer's eyes. Lawyers were trouble. They were people who could fight back, and the last thing officers like Riley and Jenkins wanted was someone who knew the law well enough to challenge them. Jamal felt his pulse quicken as the officer moved closer. Riley's hand brushed the side of his holster, a move that was subtle but unmistakable. The slight touch of metal against fabric sent a shock of adrenaline through Jamal's veins. He knew the rules, he knew the risks, but he also knew how this could end. The choice was never really his. Not when the officers had made up their minds. The pressure in the air thickened. Jamal's mind raced, and for a brief moment, he wondered if they were trying to provoke him, to get him to react. His breathing was even, but inside, his thoughts were a storm. He wasn't afraid, but he wasn't naive either. He had experienced this before, in other places, in other times. The fear wasn't about what could happen to him, but about what this encounter represented for so many others who didn't have the ability to stay composed in these situations. Before he could even respond further, Riley lunged. His hand clamped onto Jamal's arm and twisted it behind his back with painful force. Jamal gasped in shock as the sudden movement took him by surprise. His vision blurred for a moment, the sting of pain shooting through his shoulder. He didn't have time to react before Jenkins joined in, and within seconds, Jamal found himself being dragged away, struggling against the cuffs that bit into his wrists. "Take it easy," Jamal muttered under his breath. But it was no use. This wasn't about him complying, it was about their power. He could see a man passing by, his phone out, recording everything. For a second, Jamal let himself hope that maybe this time, the truth would be exposed. The phone camera might be his ally, a silent witness to this injustice. But for now, it was all Jamal could do to stay focused. He needed to remain calm, to keep his thoughts straight. Anything could be used against him now, and he knew the consequences of saying the wrong thing. His world was shrinking into nothing but the sound of his breathing and the sharp movements of the officers as they led him through the station's front doors. Jamal's heart raced as he was led through the police station's entrance, the cold metal of the handcuffs biting into his wrists. His eyes scanned the busy, fluorescent-lit interior, the harsh lights contrasting sharply with the morning's warmth outside. Officers bustled about, some chatting idly, others absorbed in paperwork, but all of them seemed oblivious to the storm that was about to unfold in their midst. Jamal was now just another body, another statistic in a system that rarely afforded people like him the benefit of doubt. He kept his head down as Officer Riley and Officer Jenkins marched him toward a holding cell at the back of the station. The officer's grip on his arms was firm, their posture tight as though they were in control of the situation. Jamal couldn't help but feel the weight of their assumptions bearing down on him, like they were already convinced of his guilt before they had even asked him a single question that made any sense. As they pushed him through the narrow corridors, the sound of their footsteps echoed off the walls, mingling with the clatter of phones, desks, and voices in the background. Once they reached the holding cell, Jamal was shoved inside. The room was small and cramped, with only a thin metal bench against one wall and a toilet in the corner. It smelled faintly of disinfectant, and the air felt heavy, as though it had been trapped here for years, stagnant and stale. Jamal glanced around, feeling a flicker of claustrophobia rise within him. This was supposed to be temporary, he told himself. He wasn't supposed to be here, and soon enough someone would figure that out. The officers left him alone, and Jamal's thoughts began to spiral. What had just happened? How had things escalated so quickly? His mind kept replaying the moments just before his arrest. His calm response, his attempt to defuse the situation with his words. But none of it mattered. Riley and Jenkins had already made their minds up. In their eyes, Jamal wasn't a person. He wasn't a lawyer, a son, a man with a life ahead of him. He was just another black man they could treat like a criminal. He tried to focus on breathing, to push the rising anger away. But it was hard. So much had been taken from him, and all for what? Because he fit a certain image, a stereotype that society had painted for him without his consent. He wasn't allowed to walk through the streets in peace. He wasn't allowed to exist without suspicion. Moments later, as Jamal tried to collect his thoughts, Officer Stevens, a younger officer who had been quietly observing from a distance, approached the cell. His expression was hard to read, but there was something in his eyes, something that suggested he wasn't fully convinced by the story Riley and Jenkins had painted. He didn't speak at first, only glanced over at Jamal, his face momentarily betraying his discomfort. Jamal met his gaze, and for a second, the two men locked eyes, two people on opposite sides of a widening divide. Jamal didn't know what the officer was thinking, but there was a flicker of hesitation in his posture. He wasn't sure if he should be here. "Can I help you?" Jamal asked quietly, trying to read the officer's intent. Stevens shifted, uncomfortable. "I just wanted to check in. They've got you locked up for resisting arrest." "But—" He trailed off, glancing back toward Riley and Jenkins, who were standing by the desk, chatting amongst themselves. Jamal felt the officer's internal struggle. He knew what Stevens was trying to say. He didn't buy the story. But what could he do? He was just another cog in the machine, and machines don't ask questions, they follow orders. "I didn't resist," Jamal said firmly. "I asked them why they wanted to see my ID. But I didn't fight back. I didn't do anything wrong." Stevens seemed to consider this for a moment, his gaze drifting back to the front desk, where Riley and Jenkins were now in a quiet argument. He hesitated, then stepped closer, his voice lowering. "I'll make a call," he whispered. Jamal gave a small, grateful nod, though he knew better than to get his hopes up. The system wasn't built for people like him to win. But in that moment, in that quiet exchange, something shifted. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Jamal clung to it. Hope, however fragile, was still hope. Stevens left quickly, and Jamal sat in the cell, the silence stretching around him. Time seemed to slow, his mind drifting as he awaited whatever came next. The longer he sat in that small, suffocating space, the more he realized this wasn't just about a case of mistaken identity. It wasn't even about the injustice he had just faced. This was bigger. This was part of something much larger, a battle he hadn't even fully understood yet. Jamal's time in the holding cell felt like an eternity. Every minute dragged on, the tick of the wall clock the only sound in the small room. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting an eerie glow over everything. His mind raced, but he remained still, trying to focus on anything other than the overwhelming sense of injustice that had taken hold of him. He had been through this before, the questioning, the tension, the suspicion, but this time felt different. Something was about to change. Outside the cell, the police station hummed with activity. Officers moved briskly through the corridors, some engrossed in their tasks, others sharing hushed conversations. There was an undercurrent of unease in the air, as if everyone knew something wasn't right, but couldn't put their finger on it. Jamal could feel it too. The weight of the situation hung over the station like a storm cloud, and he wasn't the only one who sensed that the storm was about to break. As Jamal sat in silence, trying to collect his thoughts, he couldn't help but notice the way Officer Stevens looked at him. The younger officer had approached him earlier, his face betraying a hint of doubt about the events that had led to Jamal's arrest. Stevens wasn't like Riley or Jenkins. There was a certain hesitation in his eyes, a recognition that something wasn't quite right with this arrest. Jamal wasn't sure whether it was guilt or empathy in Stevens' gaze, but he didn't care. For the first time in a long while, Jamal felt like someone on the inside was seeing him, not as a suspect but as a person. Stevens had promised to make a call, but Jamal knew that there was no guarantee it would change anything. Still, the officer's small act of rebellion had given him a glimmer of hope, and in a place like this, that was all Jamal could hold on to. Meanwhile, at the front desk, Riley and Jenkins were engaged in a tense conversation. Jamal couldn't hear their words, but their body language spoke volumes. Riley seemed on edge, his usual smug demeanor replaced by a subtle shift in posture. Jenkins, usually the quieter of the two, looked uncertain, his eyes darting nervously between Riley and the direction of the holding cells. Lieutenant Thompson, a seasoned officer who had recently joined the precinct, walked through the door with a sense of purpose. Her sharp eyes took in the scene before her, immediately sensing the unease that had settled over the station. She was new to the precinct but had quickly learned to trust her instincts. And right now, her instincts were telling her that something was wrong. She could feel the tension radiating from Riley and Jenkins, and she noticed the young Officer Stevens glancing nervously in her direction. The station was full of people going through the motions, but there was an underlying energy that couldn't be ignored. Thompson's first stop was the holding cell. She had heard the whispers, something about an arrest gone wrong, a man who wasn't just another criminal. As she approached the cell, she saw Jamal sitting quietly, his expression calm despite the circumstances. There was something about him that made her pause. He wasn't the typical suspect. She couldn't explain it, but her gut told her there was more to this situation than met the eye. "This is him?" Thompson asked, turning to Riley, who had followed her to the cell. Riley looked uneasy but nodded. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Resisted arrest. We had no choice." Thompson studied Jamal's face for a moment. His posture was relaxed, his hands folded neatly in his lap. It didn't add up. A man who resisted arrest wouldn't be so calm, so composed. She glanced back at Riley, her suspicion growing. "Did he resist, or did you provoke him?" she asked, her voice sharp. Riley hesitated. "He questioned us. Things got tense. We had to arrest him." Thompson's gaze narrowed. She wasn't buying it. There was more to this, and she was determined to find out what. She turned to Stevens, who had stepped forward, clearly uneasy with the situation. "Stevens," she said, her tone softening slightly. "What's your take on this?" Stevens swallowed hard, his eyes flicking between Riley and Jamal. "I don't know, Lieutenant," he said quietly. "Something feels off. I looked him up. His name is Jamal West. He's not just some random guy. He's a lawyer, a civil rights lawyer." Thompson's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't show her shock. A civil rights lawyer? That explained why he seemed so composed. It explained why he wasn't reacting the way the officers expected. Jamal West wasn't just any man. They had arrested someone who could potentially tear apart everything they had built. She turned back to Riley, who was now looking uncomfortable. "You didn't check his ID?" she asked, her voice cold. "You didn't even bother to ask who he was before treating him like a criminal?" Riley's expression faltered, and for a brief moment, the confident exterior he had built up cracked. "We didn't think he was anyone important," he muttered, his eyes cast downward. "Well, he is," Thompson snapped, her patience wearing thin. "And if you don't handle this carefully, it's not just your career's at risk. It's the entire department." The gravity of the situation hit Riley then, and he straightened, his previous arrogance replaced by a growing sense of dread. He hadn't just arrested any random man. He had arrested someone who was going to expose everything they had been trying to hide. Thompson's mind raced. She knew the truth now. This wasn't just a case of mistaken identity. This was a much bigger issue. And if Jamal West was the man she suspected him to be, this could be the beginning of something monumental. Lieutenant Thompson was no stranger to difficult situations. A few weeks into her new position at the station, she had quickly established herself as someone who could navigate tricky scenarios with authority and poise. But what was unfolding in front of her was different. Jamal West's arrest wasn't just a misstep. It was a spark that could ignite something much larger. As she processed the information about his identity, the weight of the situation began to settle heavily in her chest. This wasn't a typical case. This wasn't even just about a bad arrest. This was a crossroads. One where the choices made could either lead to resolution or to a scandal that would engulf the entire department. Thompson's eyes flickered to Jamal in the holding cell. He was still seated, his hands neatly folded in his lap, his expression calm but determined. If there was one thing she could give him credit for, it was his ability to stay composed under pressure. Thompson could see the quiet resolve in his posture. He wasn't here by accident. He had known exactly what this moment could mean, and he was prepared for whatever came next. Turning back to Riley and Jenkins, Thompson's thoughts raced. The officers had clearly failed in their judgment and actions. It was one thing to make a mistake. It was another to act with such disregard for due process. She could tell from Riley's shifting demeanor and Jenkins' defensive posture that they were scrambling for a way out of the mess they had created. But Thompson wasn't about to let them off the hook. Not this time. "Riley Jenkins," she said sharply, "I want a full report on this incident. Every detail. I want to know why you decided to arrest him, why you didn't follow proper procedure. And I want it on my desk within the hour." Riley's face flushed as he nodded. He was clearly trying to maintain his composure, but Thompson could see the anxiety creeping into his eyes. This wasn't just a typical internal review. If Jamal West followed through with what she suspected he would do, the ramifications could be far-reaching. Thompson felt the first wave of dread settle over her. She knew she had to act quickly and decisively, or this would spiral beyond anyone's control. As the officers scrambled to prepare their reports, Thompson turned her attention back to Stevens. The young officer had been the only one to show any signs of doubt, and Thompson wasn't about to let that go unnoticed. "Stevens," she said, her voice softer but still firm, "you're with me. I need you to track down anything you can find on Jamal West. I want to know who he is, what he's been involved with, and what kind of impact his arrest could have. Don't leave any stone unturned. I'll be in my office." Stevens nodded quickly, his face reflecting the seriousness of the task at hand. "Understood, Lieutenant. I'll get on it right away." As Stevens left the room to begin his search, Thompson's mind continued to churn. Jamal West wasn't just a civil rights lawyer. He was a man with the power to expose everything the department had been trying to sweep under the rug. The thought of that made her stomach turn. She had come here to fix things, to be part of a department that upheld justice. But now, her own colleagues were embroiled in something much darker than she had anticipated. Thompson took a deep breath and walked down the hallway toward her office. The air felt thicker, almost suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in. She knew this was just the beginning. Whatever Jamal West was planning, whatever he was capable of, it would be nothing short of a reckoning. Back in the holding cell, Jamal remained still, his mind racing with thoughts of what was to come. He had been in situations like this before, but never one so fraught with danger. He could feel it in his bones. This wasn't just about his arrest. It was about what his presence here meant. He was more than just a man wrongfully detained. He was a symbol that, if used correctly, could turn the tide in a much larger fight. Jamal didn't know how things would unfold from here, but one thing was certain. This moment, this arrest, would not be the end. It would be the beginning of something much greater. As Lieutenant Thompson entered her office, the weight of the situation settled heavily on her shoulders. She sat down at her desk, her fingers tapping rhythmically against the wood as her mind worked furiously. She needed to move fast, to find out who Jamal West really was and what kind of impact this arrest would have. She couldn't afford to ignore the signs that something much bigger was unfolding. The minutes felt like hours as she waited for Stevens to return with information. She knew Jamal's profile wouldn't be easy to uncover, not with the layers of bureaucracy that clouded the truth in these cases. But she also knew one thing for certain. He was no ordinary man. His arrest was just the tip of the iceberg, and the deeper she dug, the more she feared what she might uncover. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a knock at the door. Stevens entered, his face a little paler than usual, his eyes filled with something close to apprehension. He didn't need to speak for Thompson to understand that the information he had uncovered was both shocking and troubling. "Lieutenant," Stevens said quietly, "I found some things about Jamal West. He's not just a lawyer, he's one of the most prominent civil rights attorneys in the country. He's worked on high-profile cases against police misconduct, and he's been involved in federal investigations into systemic corruption within law enforcement." Thompson's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just a man with a reputation for taking on tough cases. This was someone who had been actively working to expose the very things that could tear the department apart. The realization hit her like a punch in the gut. They had arrested someone who could bring down an entire system of power, and now they were going to have to deal with the fallout. Stevens handed Thompson his phone, which displayed an article detailing Jamal West's most recent work, an investigation into a series of unsolved police misconduct cases, ones that had been swept under the rug by powerful individuals within the department. Jamal had been gathering evidence, working with federal agents, and had even filed several lawsuits against local police departments for racial profiling and unlawful arrests. The officer's face reflected a mix of concern and guilt. This could be bad, Lieutenant. If he decides to go public with this, if he takes this to the press, there's no telling what could happen. The department's reputation will be destroyed. Thompson's mind raced. She knew Stevens was right. Jamal West wasn't just a target of bad policing. He was the kind of man who could change the landscape of law enforcement if he decided to fight back. He had already exposed systemic failures in multiple departments across the country. And now, here he was, sitting in a holding cell in her precinct. This wasn't a small mistake. This was a full-blown disaster waiting to happen. She stood up, pacing the room. The adrenaline coursed through her veins as she weighed her options. Jamal's arrest was an obvious breach of protocol. But that was just the surface. Beneath it all was a deeper truth. The department had made a grave error, one that could lead to even bigger consequences if not handled correctly. Thompson's thoughts were interrupted by the sudden appearance of Chief Daniels. His face flushed with anger as he stormed into her office. The moment he entered, Thompson knew things were about to escalate. Daniels was a man who liked to maintain control, and this situation was slipping through his fingers. "What the hell is going on, Thompson?" Daniels demanded, his voice booming with authority. "You let one of our officers make a serious mistake, and now we're in damage control mode. What the hell did you get us into?" Thompson met his gaze, unflinching. "This isn't just a mistake, Chief. Jamal West is a civil rights lawyer who has been working to expose police corruption. He's connected to a federal investigation into the department." Daniel's face paled as the implications hit him. "Federal investigation?" he repeated, his voice dropping. "How did we not know who we were dealing with?" Thompson clenched her fists. "It doesn't matter how we got here. What matters now is how we fix this. If Jamal decides to file charges or go public with what he knows, we'll have more than just an internal investigation on our hands. We'll be facing federal scrutiny." Daniels nodded slowly, his mind clearly racing as he processed the gravity of the situation. "We need to contain this. We can't let the media get hold of this, not until we figure out our next move." Thompson felt her stomach drop. She didn't like the sound of that. She wasn't in this to cover up the truth. She was in it to protect the community, to ensure justice was served. But right now, she had to work within the system, at least until she figured out how to use the system to her advantage. "We need to release him," Thompson said firmly. "We can't keep him here. The longer we do, the worse it's going to look. But we need to prepare for the fallout. We need to control the narrative before it spirals out of control." Daniels nodded. "I'll get the press team on it. But we need to move quickly. Get him out of here, but make sure we have a plan in place. We can't let this destroy everything we've worked for." Thompson watched as Daniels left the office, his footsteps heavy with the weight of the decisions they were about to make. She turned to Stevens, her mind already working on the next steps. "Get ready. Jamal's release won't be the end of this. It's just the beginning." Stevens nodded and left the room, and Thompson sat down at her desk, her fingers running through her hair in frustration. This was a mess, and no matter what they did, the consequences were already set in motion. As the minutes passed, the air in the room seemed to grow thicker, and Thompson could feel the weight of the storm gathering on the horizon. This wasn't just about an arrest. This was about a reckoning, one that would shake the department to its core. The quiet tension of the police station was palpable as the officers scrambled to figure out their next move. The arrest of Jamal West had thrown everything off balance. It was no longer just about a misunderstanding, it was a ticking time bomb. The deeper Thompson dug into Jamal's background, the clearer it became that this wasn't an ordinary case of wrongful arrest. Jamal was a man with powerful connections, a lawyer who specialized in civil rights and had been involved in exposing systemic corruption within law enforcement for years. He wasn't someone the department could simply brush aside. Outside the station, a crowd had begun to gather. Word had spread quickly, and as the media started showing up, the pressure mounted. Jamal's name was already being whispered among activists, journalists, and community leaders. If he chose to go public with his story, if he told the world who he was and why he was being treated this way, the department would be in deep trouble. The last thing Thompson wanted was to see her department crumble under the weight of a scandal. But there was no turning back now. As much as Thompson wanted to believe that they could contain the fallout, she knew the truth was much more complicated. She had been given a mandate to fix things, to bring order to a station that had been plagued by dysfunction. But now, she realized that fixing things wasn't about sweeping this under the rug. It was about addressing the truth, no matter how messy it was. Thompson walked out of her office, her gaze scanning the busy station floor. Officers were now working in a frenzy, trying to process the situation before the media arrived. The press was relentless, hungry for a story that would make headlines. But Thompson knew they wouldn't just settle for a simple arrest. They would dig deeper. They would ask questions, and they would find answers that no one wanted to hear. As she moved through the station, Thompson caught sight of Officer Stevens once again. His expression was tense as he stood near the entrance, his phone pressed to his ear. He looked over at Thompson as she approached, his face tight with worry. "Lieutenant," Stevens said, hanging up the phone. "I've got more information. Jamal West. He's been involved in a federal investigation. He's been working with agents on a corruption case that's been brewing for months." Thompson's heart sank. The pieces were starting to fall into place, and the truth was uglier than she had imagined. Jamal West wasn't just an innocent man caught in a bad situation. He was part of a much larger puzzle, a piece that, if properly placed, could expose everything. "What kind of corruption?" Thompson asked, her voice low, knowing that Stevens' next words would change everything. "He's been investigating local police departments, including ours," Stevens said, his eyes flicking nervously around the station. "There are ties to illegal activities, abuse of power, and systemic misconduct that stretches across departments nationwide." Thompson felt a cold shiver run down her spine. This wasn't just a legal battle. This was a battle for the soul of the police department. If Jamal had been gathering evidence for months, if he had information that could bring down the system, this arrest would be the tipping point. The entire department was at risk. "Is there a way to handle this quietly?" Thompson asked, knowing the answer. There was no way to keep this under wraps. Not when it was already out in the open. Not when they had arrested someone who could unravel everything. "We need to release him," Stevens said, his voice urgent. "If we don't, the media will get hold of it and the press will destroy us. If we handle it poorly, it could escalate to a national story. This could blow up in our faces." Thompson didn't need any further convincing. She knew the stakes were too high to ignore. The damage had already been done, and now it was time to contain it. "I'll make the call," she said, her voice steady but with a hint of urgency. "We'll release him, but we need to be ready for the fallout. We can't let this become a circus." Stevens nodded, but there was no comfort in his expression. He knew this was just the beginning of something much bigger. They were about to open a door that couldn't be closed again. As Thompson moved toward the front desk, she felt the weight of her position more than ever. This wasn't just about an arrest. This was about justice and the department's ability to serve it. She had to make sure Jamal's release didn't become a scandal. But more importantly, she had to ensure that whatever happened next, the truth was heard. She made the call to release Jamal West, her fingers trembling slightly as she dialed the number. The officer on the other end of the line assured her that it would be handled swiftly. But as Thompson ended the call, she felt the first wave of doubt crash over her. This was a defining moment. It could either lead to resolution or expose everything they had worked so hard to protect. Minutes later, Jamal West was escorted from his holding cell. The media had gathered outside, and reporters shouted questions as he emerged. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation, and Thompson could feel the eyes of the entire station on her. Jamal walked with the calm authority of a man who had already won. His head held high as he passed through the crowd. For a moment, the world outside seemed to fade as he turned and locked eyes with Thompson. There was no animosity in his gaze, only quiet understanding, as if he knew this was only the beginning of something much larger. Thompson watched as Jamal disappeared into the crowd, surrounded by his supporters. The media was already clamoring to get his side of the story, but Jamal didn't respond. He walked straight to his waiting family and friends, his focus unwavering. In that moment, Thompson knew Jamal West had just won. And for the department, the reckoning had only just begun. The media frenzy outside the station had only intensified as Jamal West's release became the story of the day. The cameras flashed relentlessly, capturing every step he took as he made his way through the crowd. Reporters shouted his name, clamoring for a statement, but Jamal remained silent, his eyes fixed ahead as he walked toward the waiting car that would take him to his next destination. There was a palpable sense of victory in the air, but beneath it, a heavy tension lingered. The battle was far from over. Inside the station, Lieutenant Thompson sat at her desk, staring out of the window toward the chaotic scene unfolding outside. She knew this was just the beginning of the storm. The press would continue to dig, and Jamal's silence spoke volumes. It was clear that he had a plan, one that would unfold in the coming days and weeks. If she had any doubts about the gravity of the situation, they were gone now. Jamal West was not just an attorney or an activist. He was a force of change, and the department was about to feel the full force of his reach. Thompson leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples as she processed everything that had happened. The arrest had been a mistake, a catastrophic one. But it was also a catalyst, one that had ignited a fire that couldn't be extinguished. The department would be under scrutiny, not just from the public, but from federal agencies that had been investigating systemic corruption for years. Jamal's arrest was no longer just an isolated incident. It was a symbol of everything that was wrong with the system, and the world was watching. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a knock at the door. She turned to see Chief Daniels standing in the doorway, his face a mask of frustration. "Lieutenant," Daniels said, his voice tight, "I need a full report on my desk by the end of the day. We need to know what went wrong, how we let this happen. We need to control the narrative before it spirals out of control." Thompson nodded, but there was no comfort in her agreement. "We can't control the narrative anymore, Chief. This is bigger than just an arrest. Jamal West is involved in a federal investigation into police corruption. His case is going to bring everything to light, whether we like it or not." Daniel's face went pale. "You're telling me that arresting this guy could be the end of everything we've worked for?" Thompson didn't answer right away. She knew what Daniels was asking. He wasn't just concerned about the department's reputation. He was concerned about his own. The weight of the situation pressed down on them both, but Thompson knew that protecting the department meant facing the truth, even if that truth was ugly. She had to act, not just for the department, but for the community they had sworn to protect. "We have no choice now," Thompson said finally, her voice resolute. "We have to come clean. We need to show the public that we're willing to hold ourselves accountable. If we try to cover this up, we'll lose everything. We have to start by getting ahead of the media, by being transparent about what happened." Daniels looked hesitant, but he nodded. "I'll start preparing a statement. We need to move fast on this." Thompson watched him leave, the door clicking shut behind him. She felt a sense of dread wash over her, but beneath it was something else, a sense of determination. This was her chance to make a real difference. This was her moment to do the right thing, even if it meant risking everything. She knew Jamal's fight was only just beginning, but now so was hers. She had a choice to make. She could be part of the system that had failed Jamal and countless others, or she could stand up and help change it. Her decision wasn't just about this case. It was about every case, every officer, and every person who had been harmed by the system. The battle for justice was far from over. The following days were a blur of meetings, press conferences, and heated discussions. The department was under full scrutiny, and Thompson knew that the clock was ticking. Every move she made, every word she spoke would be dissected by the media and the public. There was no room for error. She had to walk a fine line between protecting the department's integrity and being honest about its flaws. Jamal West had already begun his own campaign. He gave interviews, attended rallies, and spoke with reporters about the broader issue of police corruption and systemic racism. His calm demeanor in the face of adversity only added to his strength. He wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for everyone who had been wronged by the system. And he was winning. But as the pressure mounted, so did the stakes. Lieutenant Thompson knew that if she couldn't steer the department through this crisis, it would all come crashing down. Her next steps would be critical. She could feel the weight of the department's reputation resting on her shoulders, but she also knew that she couldn't let fear guide her decisions. As the days wore on, Thompson continued to meet with Jamal's legal team, gathering information and preparing for what was to come. She knew the department was about to undergo a significant transformation, one that would require tough decisions, painful truths, and the willingness to confront its darkest secrets. But she also knew that this was a turning point. The change that had been so desperately needed was finally on the horizon. Jamal's fight wasn't just for justice in his own case. It was for justice in every case. And as Thompson prepared to take the next steps, she realized that her fight, too, was just beginning. The following day, the police station buzzed with an energy that Thompson couldn't quite place. It was as if the entire building had been electrified, but instead of the usual hum of routine operations, it felt like every inch of the station was alive with nervous tension. Reporters had taken up posts outside, their cameras flashing and microphones poised, ready to capture any moment that might add fuel to the fire. There was no escaping the media circus. What had started as a simple arrest had now morphed into a public spectacle that threatened to engulf the department. Inside the station, Thompson met with her team to discuss their approach. The public statement was ready, but she knew it wouldn't be enough. The damage was done, and now it was time to navigate the aftermath. There was no way to reverse what had happened. Jamal West's arrest had already become a symbol, a rallying point for the growing outrage over police misconduct. If the department hoped to maintain any credibility, they needed to handle the situation with the utmost care. "We have to be transparent," Thompson said, her voice steady but firm. "We can't lie or downplay what happened. Jamal's arrest was wrong. We need to acknowledge that. But we also need to show that we're taking responsibility. We're going to cooperate fully with the investigation, and we're going to make sure that something like this never happens again." Her team nodded in agreement, but Thompson could sense the unease in the room. The situation had escalated far beyond what they had anticipated, and no amount of press conferences or statements would take away the damage. The department was being scrutinized by the media, the public, and the government. It wasn't just about Jamal anymore. It was about everything the department had failed to do for years. Outside, the crowd had grown larger, and the media presence intensified. Thompson could see reporters clustering together, ready to seize on any hint of weakness or contradiction. They weren't here for apologies, they were here for blood. The public was hungry for justice, and right now, Jamal West was the face of that fight. At the front of the station, Jamal's supporters had gathered, holding signs that read, "Justice for Jamal," and "End Police Brutality." His family stood by, holding themselves with quiet dignity, but the looks on their faces told a different story. A story of pain, of having to fight not just for their loved one, but for an entire community that had long been treated as second-class citizens. Jamal had already spoken to the press, but the real fight was just beginning. As Thompson prepared to step into the limelight, she couldn't help but feel a knot in her stomach. This wasn't just about her department. This was about the future of policing in America. This was about systemic change, change that would require more than just words. It would take action, and it would take sacrifice. But Jamal West wasn't alone in this fight. As much as he had become a symbol of resistance, he had also become the catalyst for something larger, a movement that could bring real change. Thompson knew that she had a responsibility to ensure that movement didn't die here, today, at the steps of this police station. The battle for accountability, for transparency, for justice, it wasn't something that could be ignored any longer. She stepped out from the station's entrance, her eyes immediately meeting the sea of cameras. The reporters shouted questions, demanding answers, but Thompson stayed calm, her face a mask of professionalism. She could hear the crowd chanting Jamal's name, their voices a chorus of unity and defiance. She approached the podium, her prepared statement in hand. But as she looked out over the crowd, her mind briefly flickered to Jamal West, who was standing quietly at the edge, watching her. He hadn't spoken publicly much since his release, but his presence now felt like a quiet challenge, a reminder that this wasn't just about what happened in the past, but about what would happen moving forward. Thompson took a deep breath and stepped forward to the microphone. The camera lights intensified, and the noise of the crowd seemed to fade into a dull hum. This was it, the moment of truth. "We are here today to address the wrongful arrest of Jamal West," Thompson began, her voice clear and steady. "This arrest should never have happened. Jamal West is not just a victim of this incident. He is a symbol of the greater fight for justice, for equality, for the protection of our civil rights. We acknowledge that what happened here was a failure of the system, and we will take responsibility for it." She paused, letting her words settle in the air. The reporters were quiet now, hanging on every word. "We are committed to full transparency in the investigation," she continued. "We will be cooperating fully with federal authorities, and we will be reevaluating our policies and procedures to ensure that something like this never happens again. Our department is committed to reform. We will not stand by while injustice continues." Thompson felt the weight of her words as they echoed through the crowd. The statement wasn't perfect. It wasn't enough to erase the damage that had been done. But it was a step, an important step in acknowledging that the department was ready to confront its flaws. The media erupted with questions, but Thompson held her ground. She didn't need to answer every question right now. What mattered was that the department had taken a stand. What mattered was that they had promised to change. And in that moment, Thompson realized something. This fight wasn't just Jamal's. It was hers too. She had the power to change things, to make sure that what had happened to Jamal never happened to anyone else again. Jamal West walked out of the station with his head held high, his family and friends flanking him as they pushed through the crowd. The cheers of his supporters echoed in his ears, a sound he had not been prepared for. But this wasn't the moment of triumph. This wasn't his victory. Not yet. He had not come this far only to bask in the spotlight. His fight was far bigger than that. The media, however, was relentless. Reporters crowded around him, shouting questions. The cameras flashed, and Jamal, though calm, could feel the weight of their scrutiny pressing on him. They wanted answers, but he had no intention of giving them anything just yet. This wasn't the time for words. He would speak when the time was right. Today, he would remain silent, not out of fear, but as a reminder that sometimes silence speaks louder than anything. As he walked through the crowd, Jamal could hear the whispers, the excitement, the anticipation. People were already calling him a hero, but he wasn't interested in the title. He didn't need accolades. He needed justice. He needed accountability. And he knew that today was just the first chapter of a much longer journey. Behind him, Thompson stepped out from the shadows of the station, her face grim but resolute. She had done what she could. She had issued the public apology, acknowledged the wrong, and promised reform. But Jamal knew the apology meant little unless it was backed by real action. He had heard too many hollow apologies in his life. What mattered now was the action that followed. As Jamal's family and friends gathered around him, he exchanged a brief look with Lieutenant Thompson, who stood at the back, watching from a distance. It was a look of understanding, a mutual recognition that the road ahead would not be easy, but it was a road they would walk together if necessary. Jamal didn't trust the system, not yet. He had been betrayed by it too many times to believe that a few promises would change anything. But as he stood there, surrounded by his loved ones, he couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. Perhaps this time things would be different. Maybe the pressure of the media, the public, and the federal investigation would force the system to change. Or maybe, just maybe, the fight for justice would be long enough to make a real difference. Thompson watched the scene unfold, her mind racing. The reality of the situation had only just begun to set in. Jamal's release had been the easy part. Now came the difficult work, dismantling the system of corruption that had allowed his wrongful arrest to happen in the first place. She had no illusions about how long this would take. Real reform didn't happen overnight, and she wasn't sure if the department had the courage to see it through. But one thing was clear: she wasn't going to back down. As Jamal finally made his way to the car, he gave Thompson a final, lingering glance. For the first time in a long while, she could see the slightest trace of uncertainty in his eyes, a flicker of doubt. But he held it together. He wasn't about to let this setback define him. Not now, not ever. "Thank you," Jamal said quietly, his voice carrying just enough weight for Thompson to hear. He wasn't speaking just to her. He was speaking to anyone who would listen. Speaking to a world that had wronged him, a world that had failed so many others like him. Thompson nodded in return. "This is far from over," she said, her voice steady. "We'll get this right." And with that, Jamal entered the car, his supporters closing ranks around him. The sound of the crowd cheering began to fade as they drove off into the distance, leaving the station and the chaos behind. Thompson stood in the same spot for a moment longer, taking in the full weight of the situation. She had made a promise to Jamal, to the community, to herself, to right the wrongs that had been done. But as the dust began to settle, she realized that the hard work was just beginning. There would be investigations, hearings, and endless public scrutiny. The department would be forced to face its flaws head-on, and there was no turning back. Jamal had taken the first step, and now it was time for Thompson to take hers. The following weeks brought the storm that everyone had been waiting for. Jamal's legal team filed a federal lawsuit against the department, and the media coverage exploded. The story was everywhere. What started as a wrongful arrest had quickly turned into an international conversation about police misconduct and racial profiling. Jamal had become the face of a movement, his name synonymous with the fight for justice in a broken system. Thompson found herself at the center of the storm. Every day brought new challenges. More calls from the press, more meetings with higher-ups, more demands for answers. But in all the chaos, she stayed focused on one thing: the truth. She had to help the department face its mistakes. She had to help them rebuild from the inside out, no matter how painful the process would be. Meanwhile, Jamal was not sitting idle. He spoke at rallies, met with community leaders, and pushed for sweeping reforms within the department. His story became a symbol not just for the fight for justice, but for the strength of those who had been systematically oppressed for far too long. Every speech, every interview, every appearance only fueled the fire of change that he had started. But despite the growing momentum, Thompson knew that change was not going to come easily. The department had entrenched interests that would resist reform, that would fight tooth and nail to protect the status quo. But Jamal's story was too powerful, too raw, to ignore. And with every passing day, more and more people joined the fight. One morning, as Thompson was reviewing yet another round of press inquiries, she received a phone call from the mayor's office. They wanted to meet, and they needed her to bring answers. It was clear that the pressure was mounting from all sides. "Lieutenant Thompson," the mayor's voice crackled over the phone, "this is going to get worse before it gets better. We need to figure out a way to not only stop the bleeding but also start the healing. You've got the department's fate in your hands now. Handle it carefully." Thompson exhaled slowly as she stared out the window, her gaze focused on the future. She knew what she had to do. She couldn't back down. She couldn't let Jamal's fight for justice be in vain. There was a way forward, and it was time to start charting that course. Weeks passed, but the intensity of the situation only grew. The city was still reeling from Jamal West's wrongful arrest and the subsequent revelations about the department's deep-rooted issues. Lieutenant Thompson was in the eye of the storm, trying to maintain some sense of order amidst the chaos. The lawsuits, public outcry, and media coverage all pointed to one thing: accountability was no longer optional. It was imperative. Thompson sat in a room with senior officers, legal counsel, and members of the city's political leadership. The mayor had demanded a full plan for reform, and Thompson had been tasked with making it happen. It wasn't just about appeasing the public. It was about saving the integrity of the police force, and in some ways, the future of law enforcement in the city. Her mind was sharp, her focus unwavering. Every step they took had to be calculated. She couldn't afford to make a misstep. The department needed a roadmap for change, a way forward that acknowledged past mistakes and set the stage for real transformation. And that transformation had to start with holding those accountable for Jamal's wrongful arrest, and the system that allowed it to happen. "I've been thinking," Thompson began, looking around the room at the faces that had grown increasingly somber, "that the only way we can rebuild trust with the community is by showing them that we're not just talking about change, we're actively pursuing it. We need external oversight, independent reviews of every department policy, and a commitment to transparency that's beyond reproach." The room was silent for a moment as the officers absorbed her words. They had heard similar talks before about reform, about change, but there was something different in Thompson's tone. It was clear she wasn't just speaking from a place of duty, she was speaking from conviction. She had seen the flaws in the system up close, and now she was determined to fix them. "We need to create a task force for independent oversight," Thompson continued. "We also need to make a clear public commitment to retraining officers, ensuring they understand the consequences of their actions, not just from a legal perspective but from a human one. Every officer needs to be accountable not just to the law, but to the communities they serve." Thompson's words weren't just a roadmap. They were a call to action. The officers in the room knew the stakes were higher than they had ever been. They could no longer pretend that the status quo was acceptable. Jamal's arrest had exposed everything that was wrong with the department, and now they had to prove they were ready to fix it. But there were still obstacles. Not everyone in the room agreed with the changes Thompson was proposing. Some were hesitant, unsure if the public would ever forgive them, unsure if the department could withstand the pressure. They feared the consequences of admitting their flaws, of truly holding themselves accountable. "Lieutenant," one officer finally spoke up, his voice heavy with doubt, "how can we expect the public to believe us? How do we convince them that we're not just trying to salvage our image? The damage is done." Thompson met his gaze, her resolve clear. "We prove it with action. We show them we're serious by actually doing the hard work. It's not about what we say, it's about what we do. We can't undo the mistakes of the past, but we can create a future where this doesn't happen again." She paused, letting her words hang in the air. The room was still, but something had shifted. The officers could feel the weight of her vision. They could sense the urgency behind her words. This wasn't just another meeting. This was a defining moment. Over the following days, Thompson worked tirelessly to put her plans into motion. She reached out to Jamal West's legal team, to federal investigators, and to activists in the community. She began drafting a public statement that would be the department's commitment to transparency and reform. At the same time, Jamal's fight continued outside the station. His legal team filed additional motions, pushing for greater accountability. His supporters rallied, demanding not just an apology, but real, substantive changes. The department was now at the mercy of the court of public opinion, and Jamal West was the driving force behind it all. On a crisp morning, just a few days after the internal meetings, Thompson stood at the podium in front of a sea of reporters. The public statement was ready. She had crafted it carefully, knowing that every word would be dissected, every nuance analyzed. The department was about to lay bare its flaws and promise reform. But it wasn't going to be easy. Thompson knew that this was the moment of truth. Either the department would take the first step toward real accountability, or it would continue to spiral into irrelevance. She looked out over the crowd, her eyes briefly locking with Jamal's, who stood at the back, watching the proceedings. It was a quiet acknowledgement between the two of them, an unspoken understanding that this fight wasn't over, but they had come a long way. She cleared her throat and began. "We stand here today," she said, her voice steady, "not as individuals, but as an institution that has failed in its duties. We have failed to protect our community. We have failed to hold ourselves accountable. And for that, we apologize. But apologies are not enough. They will never be enough. What we are committing to today is a future where accountability is at the heart of everything we do. Thompson went on to outline the department's new reforms: independent oversight committees, full public disclosure of every police misconduct case, mandatory bias training, and, most crucially, the establishment of community-led forums where citizens could hold the department accountable. The message was clear. The department was no longer a closed-off institution, hiding behind walls of silence. It was opening itself up to scrutiny, to change, and to accountability. When the speech ended, there was no immediate cheer, no applause. But as Thompson stepped down from the podium, she felt the heavy weight of the moment. It was only the beginning. The work ahead would be difficult, but it had to be done. Later that evening, Jamal West gave his own speech. He spoke of hope, of change, and of the long road ahead. "We're not just fighting for justice," he said, his voice strong. "We're fighting for a better future, for all of us. We're fighting for a future where our children can walk the streets without fear, where we can trust those who are meant to protect us." The crowd erupted into applause, but Jamal's eyes remained focused ahead, on the work still to be done. The fight for justice had taken a huge leap forward, but it was far from over. Thompson knew that, too, and she was ready to walk the long road toward real change, no matter where it led. In the weeks that followed, the full weight of the department's reforms began to take shape. Lieutenant Thompson and her team worked tirelessly to implement the changes outlined in her speech. They created the Independent Oversight Committee, ensured the full disclosure of police misconduct cases, and organized regular community forums where citizens could voice their concerns directly to the department. The press releases, the interviews, and the public statements were all part of a larger, ongoing effort to rebuild the trust that had been shattered, not just with Jamal, but with the entire community. But reform wasn't just about policies or public statements. It was about changing the culture within the department itself. And that was going to take time. Thompson spent countless hours in meetings, talking to officers, listening to their concerns, and working through the deep-rooted resistance to change. Some officers were more open to the new approach, while others resented the idea of being scrutinized so closely. But Thompson knew that change couldn't happen without addressing the fears and frustrations within the department itself. It was at one of the community forums, a month after Jamal's release, that Thompson truly began to see the impact of their efforts. The forum was held in a local church, a space where the community had gathered for decades to discuss issues that affected them all. The room was packed. Residents, activists, lawyers, even former police officers who had once been part of the department. Jamal was there, of course, and for the first time, Thompson saw the full scope of what he represented. He wasn't just a lawyer fighting for justice. He was the embodiment of the change that the community had been demanding for years. The conversation was intense, passionate, and, at times, uncomfortable. But it was also necessary. People didn't hold back. They shared their stories of discrimination, of police violence, of the feeling that they were never seen as equal members of society. And as Thompson listened, she understood. These weren't just isolated incidents. These were symptoms of a broken system that had allowed injustice to flourish for far too long. Jamal spoke during the forum, his words resonating with everyone in the room. "Justice isn't a moment, it's a movement," he said. "We're not just asking for accountability. We're asking for a complete transformation of the way we think about policing. For far too long, the system has protected itself. Now, it's time for the system to protect the people." His words hung in the air long after he had finished speaking. There was a long silence, and then the room erupted into applause, not just because of what Jamal had said, but because the community felt seen. For the first time, it seemed like the department was finally listening, finally willing to be held accountable. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Thompson was moved by the experience, but she also knew the road ahead would be long. The changes they had implemented were just the beginning. The department's work wasn't over, and neither was Jamal's fight. He had promised the community that he wouldn't stop until justice was fully served, and Thompson couldn't help but admire his commitment. He wasn't in it for personal gain. He was in it for the future of the community, for the generations to come. As the forum ended and people began to filter out of the room, Jamal approached Thompson. He had been quiet during the discussions, but his presence had been felt throughout. Now, as they stood in the back of the room, he looked at her with a steady, unwavering gaze. "This isn't the end," Jamal said quietly. "This is just the beginning." Thompson nodded, understanding the weight of his words. "I know, but we're on the right path. It's going to take time, but we'll get there. Together." Jamal's expression softened, and for the first time since the arrest, Thompson saw a glimmer of relief in his eyes. It wasn't a smile. Jamal wasn't a man who smiled easily, especially after everything he had been through. But it was a look of quiet acknowledgement that, for all the hardships they had endured, they were finally on the same side. The next few months were filled with hard work, and while progress was slow, it was steady. The Oversight Committee began holding regular reviews of the department's practices, ensuring that the new policies were being followed and that officers were held accountable. The community forums became a staple, offering a space for residents to speak directly to the department about their concerns and to offer suggestions for improvement. At the same time, Jamal's efforts continued to gain momentum. He pushed for new legislation aimed at preventing police misconduct and advocating for the demilitarization of local police forces. He worked alongside activists and legal experts to push for national change, using his platform to advocate for the dismantling of systemic racism in law enforcement. Despite the challenges, Thompson felt a sense of purpose that had eluded her for years. She was no longer just a cog in a broken system. She was part of something larger, something meaningful. She was helping to shape a future where accountability and justice weren't just buzzwords, but the foundation of how law enforcement operated. One day, as she walked through the department's training facility, she paused to watch a group of new recruits practicing de-escalation techniques. The room was filled with officers who were being taught not just how to handle conflict, but how to understand the human beings they were sworn to protect. Thompson felt a surge of hope. This was what change looked like. Jamal's voice echoed in her mind. This is just the beginning. And as she watched the recruits practicing, she realized that the future was in good hands. It wasn't just about changing the department. It was about changing the way law enforcement interacted with the community. It was about creating a world where justice wasn't just a privilege, it was a right. Thompson had made mistakes in the past, but now she was doing everything she could to make things right. And in that moment, surrounded by the new recruits, she believed that change was possible. The fight wasn't over, and Jamal's path to justice was still long and uncertain. But for the first time in a long time, Thompson felt that change was not just a possibility, it was an inevitability. And as she looked out over the horizon, she knew they were walking toward a future where justice and accountability were no longer just dreams. They were reality. The days that followed Jamal's release were filled with a whirlwind of change, both inside the police department and out. As Thompson continued to work on rebuilding the department's reputation, she knew that the reforms they had promised weren't enough. Real change couldn't come just from policy changes and public statements. It had to come from the ground up. The culture within the department needed to shift, and that would take time and commitment. She met with officers one by one, listening to their concerns, addressing their frustrations, and trying to get a sense of where they stood on the changes being implemented. Some officers were more receptive than others, but all of them knew that things were changing. They couldn't pretend otherwise. The truth was out now, and it had forced the department to confront its own systemic issues. One of the toughest challenges Thompson faced was gaining the trust of the officers who had been there for years. They had been part of a system that had allowed things like Jamal's arrest to happen. They had been trained to uphold the status quo, not challenge it. And now they were being asked to unlearn everything they had been taught. It wasn't easy, but there were signs that change was happening. The officers who were open to the reforms began to engage more with the community. They attended the community forums, spoke with residents, and worked to improve their relationships with those they were meant to protect. It wasn't a perfect process, and there were still plenty of challenges, but every small victory felt like a step forward. Thompson wasn't naive enough to think that the work would be done anytime soon. The department had a long history of issues that couldn't be fixed overnight. But what she did know was that the foundation for change had been laid. The new recruits who had come through the department's reform program were learning not just how to handle tense situations, but how to approach them with empathy and understanding. They were being taught to view the people they encountered as human beings, not just suspects or criminals. And then there was Jamal. His voice was a constant presence, pushing for the changes that needed to happen. He wasn't just a lawyer. He was a leader, an advocate for justice, and someone who had become a beacon of hope for the community. His work didn't stop with the arrest. He continued to meet with community leaders, push for policy changes, and work tirelessly to expose corruption wherever he found it. But his focus now was on the long-term goal, a transformation of the entire criminal justice system. For Thompson, Jamal's presence was a reminder of why she had taken this job in the first place. She had wanted to make a difference. She had wanted to help people. And now, for the first time, it felt like she was doing just that. She wasn't just part of a broken system. She was part of the solution. One morning, after a particularly difficult meeting with the Oversight Committee, Thompson sat at her desk, her mind racing. She knew there was still so much work to be done. The department wasn't fixed yet. There would still be resistance, still be people who didn't want things to change. But the foundation had been set, and the department was starting to feel the first stirrings of accountability and reform. Thompson turned her chair toward the window, gazing out at the busy city streets. It was a clear day, and she could see the skyline in the distance. It was hard not to feel a sense of pride at how far they had come, but she also knew the journey ahead was long. Just then, her phone buzzed on her desk. She picked it up and saw a text from Jamal. "We're doing good work, but we're just getting started." Thompson smiled. She had been thinking the same thing. The truth was, Jamal's work was never just about a single victory. It was about creating a movement that would echo through the halls of law enforcement for years to come. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for every person who had ever been treated unjustly, every person who had been overlooked by the system. His fight was a reminder that no matter how many times the system failed, there would always be people willing to stand up and demand change. Thompson had been one of those people, and now, more than ever, she was committed to seeing this change through to the end. She would continue working with the community, continuing to hold the department accountable, and continue pushing for real reform. It wouldn't be easy, but she knew it was worth it. The road ahead was filled with challenges. No one could deny that. But for the first time in her career, Thompson felt like she was on the right side of history. She wasn't fighting against the system. She was fighting to change it from within. And with Jamal's unwavering commitment to justice, she knew they could make that change a reality. As the months passed, the department began to see the first tangible results of its efforts. The community's relationship with the police started to improve. Officers who had once been distant, even hostile, began to connect with residents in a way that was both meaningful and necessary. The community no longer saw the police as an occupying force but as partners in the fight for justice. And while there were still deep divides to bridge, the small victories they had achieved so far were a testament to the power of perseverance and accountability. Every day, the department worked to rebuild trust, to show that it was committed to changing, and to prove that it could be a force for good. Jamal West, still a guiding force in the community, continued his advocacy work, helping to pass new laws that would enforce stricter accountability for police officers nationwide. His work was far from over, but he could see the impact of his efforts unfolding before him. As for Lieutenant Thompson, she knew that the road ahead would continue to challenge her in ways she couldn't yet foresee. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of peace, knowing that she was part of something much larger than herself. Something that could, and would, change the future of law enforcement for good. The department had undergone a transformation that, while still in its early stages, was undeniable. Lieutenant Thompson had worked tirelessly to ensure that the reforms were more than just words on paper. Every officer, every recruit, and every member of the community was now part of this larger effort. The foundation had been set, and it was beginning to take root. The changes would not be easy or quick, but they were necessary, and for the first time it felt like the right kind of change. Thompson stood at the front of a room filled with officers at a quarterly training session. This was not like any other session they had attended before. Today's training focused on a topic that had become the department's core mission: rebuilding trust and accountability. Officers sat quietly, some with arms folded, others taking notes, but there was a new energy in the room. They were no longer resistant, they were learning. The old, stale methods of teaching had given way to a more dynamic and open approach. The department had learned to acknowledge its flaws, and now it was learning how to fix them. Today, we focus on something that should be at the core of every officer's duty. Thompson began, her voice echoing across the room. It's not just about enforcing the law. It's about creating an environment where every citizen feels that they can trust us. Trust is the most powerful tool we have. Without it, we cannot do our job. Without it, we fail as a department. As Thompson spoke, her eyes scanned the room. She saw many faces, some who had been skeptical of the reforms, others who had embraced them fully. But all of them had a common goal: to understand the importance of trust and how to rebuild it. Thompson had always believed that policing was about service, not control. She was beginning to see that the department was coming to believe the same thing. Outside the station, the community was also shifting. Jamal West's presence continued to reverberate in ways that no one had predicted. His efforts had spurred a movement, and his work had catalyzed nationwide discussions about police reform, systemic racism, and accountability. Jamal's influence was undeniable, but it was his ability to work across different communities, to bring people together, that made him such a powerful advocate for change. His public speeches had helped shape public opinion, and behind the scenes, he was actively working with lawmakers to push for legislation that would ensure the mistakes of the past would not be repeated. Jamal's campaign for justice had reached its highest point when a national police reform bill, modeled after the reforms Thompson had pushed for in their department, gained traction in Congress. This was a victory, not just for Jamal, but for the countless individuals who had fought for so long to be heard. The changes they had fought for were starting to take shape, and the ripple effects were spreading. As Thompson prepared for another community forum, she reflected on how far the department had come since that fateful day when Jamal was wrongfully arrested. The road had been long, full of personal and professional challenges, but it had also been a journey of growth and understanding. She had learned that real change didn't happen by sweeping issues under the rug or pretending they didn't exist. It happened when people, even those in positions of power, were willing to look at themselves honestly, confront their flaws, and make a real commitment to doing better. The community forums were a powerful example of this commitment. The next one, scheduled for the following evening, would be another opportunity for Thompson and the department to engage directly with the public. They had come a long way, but the work was far from over. The forums allowed residents to speak directly with officers, ask difficult questions, and offer feedback. It had become a place for genuine dialogue, not just a show of support. The community needed to feel heard, and these forums were a critical way to make that happen. Jamal, who had attended several of these forums, was always the first to speak. His presence in these meetings was a reminder to everyone that this was about more than just a department making promises. It was about creating a culture of transparency, accountability, and compassion. And it was a reminder that justice wasn't just about policies. It was about the people who worked to ensure those policies were implemented fairly and justly. Later that evening, after the forum, Thompson sat down with Jamal in her office. He was quieter than usual, thoughtful as he looked out the window at the city lights. The weight of everything that had happened seemed to hang between them, but it was no longer a burden. It was a shared understanding. "I didn't think this day would ever come," Thompson said quietly, her voice carrying the quiet weight of her own reflections. "I didn't think the department could change. But now I see that we can." Jamal nodded, his eyes meeting hers. "Change takes time, but it starts with people willing to make it happen. You've done the hard work. Now you just have to keep going." Thompson leaned back in her chair, the silence between them comfortable, knowing that this was a journey they were both still on. One that wasn't defined by any single moment, but by the commitment to continually improve, to continually evolve. "We're not done yet," she said, the words feeling more like a promise than a statement. "But we're getting closer every day." And that, she knew, was the truth. The work was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, Thompson could see the light at the end of the tunnel. Change was possible, real change, and it was beginning to unfold step by step, person by person. For Jamal, for Thompson, and for the community, the road ahead was long, but it was one they were now walking together.